Welcome back to part two of the lesson. This is the first day's lesson of World War I, and this is part two. All right, so you watched the video. You should have seen what was taking place at the time and how America reacted to it. And now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about neutrality to try to understand what it was like as a neutral or trying to stay out of the war. Remember, America's always had a strong tie to Europe. And remember, we are a nation of immigrants, especially at this point, and much of our immigration, if not almost all of our immigration, has come from Europe. And the Europeans, our ancestry being from Europe, there's a lot of ties back to the old land, okay? So many, as you see on the visual before you, many German Americans trusted the Kaisers, the Kaiser, not Kaisers. Irish Americans really, they don't like the British, so they'll be happy with anybody who is against the British. So they would sympathize more with the Germans, believe it or not. And eventually, the Americans start to side with the Allies. They start to see some connections, okay? And perhaps the biggest thing that's going to cause this to take place will be submarine warfare, and we're going to talk about that in a moment. All right, but let's look at some of the difficulties with neutrality. All right, basically, it's the economy. It's always the economy. We had trading arrangements and trade agreements with all of the countries at war with each other. Excuse me. So we are busy trying to maintain those. And the concept of neutrality should have allowed both the United States to trade with any of the countries, Germany, England, or whatever. As time goes on, it does become more difficult. We'll see why. Again, as I said earlier, we were more sympathetic to the British than we were with the Central Powers, and by the time you get to 1915, 1916, trade is really not possible. If you look at statistics, trade drops off pretty drastically through 1915 with nations like Germany and Austria and Hungary, and it actually increases to nations like Britain and France. All right, Britain, with the world's largest navy, declares a blockade of the German coast to try and prevent us or anybody else from providing supplies to Germany. And Germany answers with a brand new weapon at this point in war. It's called the Unterseeboot, or the U-boat. You are probably familiar with that term. Today we know them as submarines. And what begins is a period of a brand new type of warfare called submarine warfare. Now, there's a lot on this visual, so let me take you through this piece by piece. And then what we'll do is listen to an account of the torpedoing of the Lusitania. All right, so Germany has a brand new ship called, a new type of weapon called a submarine. It's truly not a submarine the way we think of submarines. Today, the United States, France, Russia, all have submarines that are truly submersible ships. They can pull out of port, submerge, and stay underwater for weeks and months. The only thing they're limited to is the amount of food that they can carry. Most of them are nuclear, not all of them, but many of them are nuclear powered, and nuclear powered submarines generate their own power, their own oxygen. They scrub the carbon dioxide out of the air. So they make their own fresh water, so they can pretty much stay underwater for a long time. Back in 1914, 1915, these were very crude boats. They really traveled on the surface most of the time. The same thing will apply to World War II, and we talk about it, but they travel on the surface most of the time. And they would go underwater mostly to try and avoid the enemy ships, especially after an attack. All right, so Germany begins this, and it's totally new to everybody in the world at this time. And they start sinking some ships, and this is unheard of. Being torpedoed on the high seas and left to die in a lifeboat is something that's seen by most Americans as barbaric. All right, so a couple of things take place, and there's a few biggies that happen that we need to talk about. One is the Lusitania, HMS Lusitania. In May of 1915, the Lusitania heads out of New York, heading for Great Britain, and it is torpedoed just off of the Irish coast. the ship's in foggy weather, and they stop zigzagging, and as a result the ship is torpedoed. It doesn't take long for the ship to sink. Most people are killed on the ship. 128 Americans lose their lives, and this outrages the United States. Now, the Germans argued that the ship exploded. When the torpedo hits, the Germans argue that the ship had two explosions, one where the torpedo exploded and then another one from internally. Now, interestingly enough, the second explosion was attributed to munitions on board the ship. The British and Americans deny that there were any munitions. They say it was probably the coal dust from the bunker where the coal was kept that might have exploded. Anyway, that battle goes on for quite some time. We did discover, I think it's around the year 2000, that the ship was carrying munitions to England. So if you look at it from that prospect, the Germans were correct, and they were preventing England from getting supplies. But the next ship to be sunk is the Arabic. Now, this is an unarmed passenger ship. It's also sunk. Many people lose their lives. 3 Americans are killed. And this finally gets the United States really, really upset. And Wilson starts threatening Germany with breaking diplomatic relations. Germany does not want the United States in the war at this time. So they come out with what's called the Arabic Pledge. And you can see the 2 bullets underneath the Arabic Pledge. We're going to stop attacking unarmed passenger ships. And if we do, we're going to provide for the safety of the crew and passengers for any ships that are sunk. So here is a concession to the Americans in terms of this. Now, please don't think that the Germans at this point in time were humanitarian. They were not. They were more concerned about the U.S. response than the humanitarian needs of the people. So not to say that the Germans were not humanitarian. They're at war. And when you're at war, things happen. The next ship that sunk, that's a big deal, is March 1916. It's the Sussex. It's a French ferry. It's going between England and France. It's sunk. 50 people are killed. And this, again, outrages the United States. And it leads to what is called the Sussex Pledge. And the Sussex Pledge talks about how they are going to stop sinking passenger ships. And what they're going to do then is they're going to stop merchant ships that are flagged from a belligerent. They're going to search it for contraband. If they find contraband, they're going to take the crew off the ship, and then they'll sink the ship. Now, think about that. This is an interesting concept to go at in a time of war. Today, you would not think that. This didn't happen at all in World War II. It was pure unrestricted warfare on the high seas, but this is such a new concept in 1914 and 1915 and 1916 that both sides are trying to figure out how to fight it and not seem like they're being totally ignorant of human life. All right, so they would do that, and for pretty much for most of the rest of the war, from 16 to 17, almost that year, Germany honors it, which is amazing. But Germany pretty much will honor that type thing. They will stop the ships, they will search them, they'll take the crews off, they'll provide for their safety and their comfort, and then they will sink the ships. And this will all change in February of 1917, when Germany again begins unrestricted warfare on the high seas. So when you stop about and think about this, Americans are totally outraged at what's taking place here. Now, the reason Americans are focusing mainly with their sympathies on the British is, think about it, we've got a common language. There's a lot of propaganda that takes place that the Americans believe in the British version of propaganda over the German version of the propaganda. Our laws are similar. We have a natural tie to what we believe is a republic. Now, we don't have a lot of support for Russia in this part of the war. We're not sending supplies to Russia like we will do with the Soviet Union in World War II. And a lot of that is because we don't see the Russians in the same light as we see the British. The British we see as a republic. The French we see as a republic. The Russians are seen as an autarky, A-U-T-A-R-K-Y. KY, an autarky. And that means that they are a pretty self-sufficient organization. They have a closed economy. Think of it as if you were so self-sufficient that you could go to war against another nation and you don't need help from somebody else. So Russia, again, we're not quite sure what to make of them at this point. You don't have the Russian Revolution just yet. We're going to talk about that more when we talk about the U.S. involvement in the war. But at this point, most of our sympathy, most of our direction is focused on the Allies, especially France and Great Britain at this time. All right, so let's take a look now at just a very short video clip on the sinking of the Lusitania, and that will give you an understanding of what took place when it was sunk.
On May the 1st, 1915, 2,000 passengers boarded one of the fastest, most luxurious ships in the world, the Lusitania.
She was simply a wonderful, steady ship. She had 4 red funnels, and she was a beautiful sight to see. She really was.
Edith Stanley and her family were heading home to England and into the midst of the most brutal conflict man had ever experienced. The First World War was almost a year old, and any transatlantic crossing was made potentially dangerous by the presence of German submarines. Still, the passengers felt safe. After all, the Lusitania was a passenger ship. On her last day at sea, the Lusitania was approaching the Irish coast.
It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you could see all this coastline. It was a beautiful day, couldn't have been any better. And then bang! It was a terrific bang. Dad knew what he was. I mean, that he knew darn well it was a torpedo.
The single German torpedo did such damage that the Lusitania could launch only 6 of her lifeboats before she went down.
We could not take the people in that were begging to be taken in. I mean, we'd have capsized and everybody would have gone. 1,200 drowned, didn't they? It was 1,200 drowned. More drowned than were saved.
Among those who drowned were 128 Americans.
All right, so that should give you a little bit of an understanding. Some famous Americans are on the ship that are missing at this time, and this creates an outrage. Remember, again, you've got to put yourself in the time frame that this took place in. In 1915, it was unheard of for one nation to intentionally sink a passenger ship. And the problem is the Lusitania could not launch all its lifeboats because of the way the ship was listing after the torpedo struck and the second explosion took place. And that's why they were unable. The Lusitania did have enough lifeboats to carry all the passengers. That was something that comes out after the Titanic. If you recall, with the Titanic sinking, there was not enough lifeboats for all the people on board the Titanic. So laws were changed. All ships traveling had to have enough lifeboats for everybody who was traveling on board the ship. But again, it was the type of damage and the listing or the leaning of the ship to one side that prevented the lifeboats on the other side of the ship from being deployed and helping get people in the boats. All right, so that's a little bit about the Lusitania sinking. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do some readings. All right, so what I want you to do, and you know where to find these on the website, chapter 22, there are 3 readings I'd like you to take a look at. The first one is by Newton Baker called Treatment of German Americans. And when you read that, think about what the person does at the time, and then does that same thing apply to us today? Or have we become a more intelligent, educated, and enlightened society? So I'd like you to think about that. Second thing is I'd like you to read the piece on William Jennings Bryan. You should remember who Bryan is from the Progressive Era and the Populist Movement. He's actually defending neutrality. And when you read that, look about what he's arguing, because he's responding to a letter that was written by someone who was arguing we're favoring the British over the Germans. And Jennings is trying to argue back that no, we're helping everybody here. So take a look at that and see what you get out of that one. And the last one is, I always want you to read something from